Hello, I'm Christina Presenti from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar, Prosecutors on SARTs, a Link to Justice. NSCRC would like to thank the Office for Victims of Crime for their support and funding of this webinar and the entire SART Toolkit. We would also like to offer the disclaimer that the opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent that official position or policies of the Department of Justice. Today, Patti Powers will be talking to us about prosecutors. So you can find more information about SARTs, about prosecution at the SART Toolkit, and that you can find at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patti so you can get started sharing a lot of information. And I really, again, just want to say thank you so much for being here. And with that, we will get right into the exciting information.
Hello, everyone. I'm Patti Powers, an attorney advisor with Aequitas. Prior to joining my colleagues at Aequitas, I was a senior deputy prosecuting attorney in Washington State for 27 years. During that time, I was assigned primarily to the prosecution of crimes of sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, and related homicides. I tried a substantial number of cases, including both current and cold cases of sexual assault and current and cold cases of homicide. During this time, I also supervised our sexual assault and domestic violence unit 3 times. Throughout my career, I had the privilege of working closely with law enforcement, medical professionals, system-based and community-based advocates, and experienced firsthand the invaluable resources and support from multidisciplinary professionals. So I'm honored to be with you today to discuss the involvement and contributions of prosecutors serving on sexual assault response teams. Prosecutors can provide an essential link to justice for other members of the team, and in particular for victims of sexual assault. Aequitas, and I'm proud to be an attorney advisor with Aequitas, has the mission of improving the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by assisting in developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices with the goal of increasing victim safety and offender accountability. The complex and unique dynamics of these crimes demands from all of us a nuanced response by prosecutors and allied professionals, as well as a broadened concept of what constitutes justice for victims in these cases. We're happy to provide innovating and practical technical assistance and trainings which are informed by the best practices of prosecutors and allied professionals. So turning now to a prosecutor's role on a sexual assault response team. The first thing that we know is that it's very multifaceted and begins with training that prosecutors are able to offer to other multidisciplinary partners. Training may include discussion of the elements of the crimes of sexual assault, which the prosecutor will prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but also the evidence that's necessary to support charges and enhance the potential of success in litigation, as well as applicable case law and authority. It goes further, though. Prosecutors can also discuss their experience with juries, which are composed from the community, as well as the work that prosecutors do with victims during the pretrial and trial process. In addition to this legal aspect of training, a prosecutor is also able to discuss what our process is and what it involves and how a victim's case is advanced through the criminal justice system. Prosecutors also consult frequently with investigators to ensure a trauma-informed approach in the investigation and the prosecution. And we'll be discussing in just a bit the importance of a trauma-informed approach and the components of this very important approach for victims. In addition to recognizing that the victim's trauma was caused by the offender and that the offender has the responsibility for inflicting that trauma, this approach can also help investigators and prosecutors to identify important evidence of the victim's experience of the crime. And this evidence may include physical, psychological, and physiological evidence. The prosecutor on a sexual assault response team will also provide information about charging, the factors which must be considered in charging the crime, and also, very important, what the time frame is for charging. This is critical information for other members of a SART who are all focused on offering support for the victim. Timely charging, whenever possible, is a key consideration for the SART and certainly for victims of sexual assault. This aspect of training is an important preface to a potential case review with the SART in which the prosecutor and law enforcement professionals may discuss aspects of evidence from an investigation that is pending charging, or perhaps a case that has already been litigated, with a view toward learning from past efforts and results and applying that knowledge to future cases that the SART will be reviewing. The prosecutor may also provide relevant information about the status of a case, whether it is being negotiated for an evidentiary reason or maybe it's being prepared for trial. If there are evidentiary issues which impact the effective presentation of the case, the prosecutor should discuss these concerns with the SART to obtain the feedback from the SART and possibly ways of addressing these issues so that the case can be advanced. Not only can members of a SART benefit from a prosecutor providing training and informational resources, the prosecutor will also greatly benefit from the expertise of other members of the team, including law enforcement, medical professionals, professionals from social services, advocacy, and many other professions who support and offer resources for victims. Every profession, as we know, brings with it key understanding of different aspects of victimization and a deeper understanding of the evidence which serves to effectively augment a prosecutor's ability to prepare and advance a case for the victim. Members of the team may be qualified as experts if they have not had contact or are not serving the victim, depending upon their educational background, the training that they have received or provided, and their experience in the given field. As we all know, local experts can provide valuable resources for consulting during the development of a case, as well as potentially testifying at trial. What we've discussed for these past few minutes is actually the work of justice. The victim, the victim's rights, and the victim's needs are at the center of all of our efforts as a sexual assault response team. We are all guided by the victim's right to justice, and the prosecutor provides an important link to that potential in a community-based courtroom. So we turn now to collaboration. And on a sexual assault response team, collaboration is certainly a dynamic process. Coming from different professional perspectives, members of a team will offer their input, discuss their approach, as well as the approach of other members, and then move jointly toward consensus building. Communication with other professionals and respect for other opinions will frequently cause all of us to re-examine our positions in light of this greater context. This is how we begin to demonstrate systematic responsiveness to the victim with a real commitment to amp up our best efforts to support the victim. Safety planning and protection of a victim's privacy are critical to victims of sexual assault and also to the prosecutor and other members of the multidisciplinary team. Supporting victims as they engage and participate in the criminal justice system requires inspired collaboration. There are frequently many issues which will be explored in an effort to protect community safety. Law enforcement must locate the offender, and if there is an arrest, a prosecutor will address the court with bail recommendations designed to ensure the safety of the victim. No contact or protection orders will also be sought. The prosecutor will advance an argument based upon the offender's danger to the victim and to the community. If there have been previous offenses or violations of previous terms and conditions of release, this information is going to be presented to the court. If the victim wishes to be present, she or he will be accompanied by a systems-based or community-based advocate, or sometimes by both advocates. The victim's concerns, depending upon the involved jurisdiction, may be presented by the prosecutor or the victim. Working closely with advocates is another example that is so important to a prosecutor's ability to provide the most accurate information to the court and to solidify the victim's need and right to security and safety. In addition to safety, a victim's privacy is also a key consideration. Members of the SART should be familiar with the local practices of the media. Some jurisdictions have undertaken the formation of bench, bar, and press committees, which can be an excellent approach to the ability to meet with members of the media, the opportunity to discuss the victim's needs for privacy in the context of the work of the media, and to the extent possible, working out very important accommodations. It's also important for another reason. Victims need to know whether the media is going to be in the courthouse or at a courtroom during hearings and the trial. And as members of a SART, we need to be in a position to be able to answer those questions that victims present. In many jurisdictions, victims are not filmed or recorded without their consent. The media will also not report using the victim's name, address, or other identifying features in many jurisdictions. As we all know, as members of a SART, for a victim of sexual assault, the disclosure itself is an acute event, and many victims feel as if they're stepping into a floodlight where their privacy is seriously challenged, if not jeopardized. As prosecutors and members of SARTs, we must protect the victim's privacy in the context of the media, as well as with records requests, which are frequently made. Prosecutors then will be working with law enforcement and other members to make sure that all involved professionals are familiar with the law, what reports are required to be disclosed and when, as well as any redactions which may be made pursuant to the applicable law. A victim's privacy could also be affected if the defense issued a subpoena for records held by, for example, mental health or other treating organizations. So developing strong relations with other providers, in addition to being the member of a SART, will ensure that a prosecutor will be informed of a subpoena and can prepare to respond, or if the information is to be released, to consider the information in camera and then allow the opportunity to argue whether this evidence is in fact relevant and prejudicial to the victim's privacy rights. After the privilege of serving for 27 years as a senior deputy prosecuting attorney, this is a question that I'm excited about that allows us to discuss and describe some of the most important attributes of a prosecutor in an effort to define what is a professional calling for so many prosecutors around the country. And we're looking now at some of the components of a prosecutor. We're focusing on the work of an attorney who responds to the call of being a prosecutor and who may be set apart by fearless advocacy. As prosecutors, we represent our jurisdictions, the state, but we also give voice to the rights of the victim and to our communities. There is no fear when our focus is on addressing the injury done to the victim. the necessity of holding the offender accountable, and certainly the goal of preventing further victimization in our community. We are all in this together. When we charge or indict or issue charges, we're advancing the right of the victim to be let alone, to be free from unwanted touching. To commit to this work requires the passion for doing the right thing, for serving all victims, and respecting the humanity of every victim to whom we are privileged to offer our support. These are challenging cases which are impacted by a myriad of social misperceptions, but we rise to this challenge with a commitment to give voice to the truth, to offer evidence of the victim's experience of the crime, and to establish beyond a reasonable doubt the offender's accountability. So looking at identifying champions, we need to recognize prosecutors who are champions of the cause of justice. Sexual assault cases, as all of us know, are some of the toughest, but in reality, these are some of the best cases. Which prosecutor takes them on with a passion to serve the victim and the community? Which prosecutor sees so-called challenges as actually part of the reality of the crime? A prosecutor who understands that delayed disclosure is not a problem in a case, but rather is part of the reality of that case, of that crime. The victim doesn't reach a decision not to report for a week, a month, a year, or in many cases much longer. It's the offender who causes a delay in disclosure by threats, both direct and indirect. Which prosecutor argues with passion to the jury, knowing that success is found not only in convictions, but in a trauma-informed, victim-centered prosecution? A prosecutor who is there for the victim, who isn't too busy, although 24 hours in a day frequently doesn't seem like it's enough. A prosecutor who is there when it may not be easy and it may actually be hard. This same prosecutor who is a champion will want to reach out to community professionals to develop insight, to become better, to serve more effectively, and to make a difference to every individual victim. How do we get there? What do champions draw from? Looking at this chart, we can see that the process begins with experience and developing skill. Every case, every hearing, and certainly every trial offers continuing education for prosecutors. We're always in a process of learning more and more with every jury that responds to the evidence that we present. Being committed to work with victims and for victims is a necessity. Being able to listen and to hear how a victim describes her or his experience of this crime, her or his needs for safety and privacy, fears about retribution, and the question of what to expect and how to prepare. Each of these questions, and even more questions beyond these, need to inform a prosecutor's communication with the victim. We must be prepared to respond with support and information. A prosecutor must be able and committed to understanding offenders. We all know that rape is a crime which is premeditated to some extent. It doesn't just happen, but for some period of time, however short, it's planned. If ever there was a formula for how offenders target victims, it's this. It's based upon a victim's accessibility, the offender's recognition or sensing of vulnerability, and then credibility, how the offender views credibility in a general sense, certainly not how we do as service professionals. So a victim needs to be first accessible. And this is clearly the case, as we know, when there is a relationship or an acquaintance or a social or maybe even an organizational relationship or contact. In the case of an offender who is unknown, then this may be the geographic proximity of the victim. The offender may know a victim's vulnerability from the relationship. The victim may have confided information about history or problems, or the vulnerabilities could be ostensible, as with an apparent disability. In some cases, particularly drug and alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, the offender may even create or aggravate symptoms of vulnerability. And finally, we have the offender's conception of credibility, not ours. And it may be presented as this: do you think anyone will believe you? You've been drinking. Go ahead and call the police. They're not going to listen. This coming from an offender with an offender conception of credibility. Prosecutors must be able to recognize and understand on a deeper level what the evidence means. DNA is always important, but very often it is an investigative lead. Evidence of the victim's experience that is used to communicate the reality of the crime to the jury is critical. Beginning with jury selection, the prosecutor is going to ask questions that allow the jury to access their own life experience so that later on, when they hear the victim's experience presented in testimony, they're going to be able to draw that parallel and better relate to the victim's experience of the crime. Identifying common misconceptions about victims, victimization, and offenders is important to all of us on the SART. We need to use language, we used to use language of stranger and non-stranger rape or sexual assault. We've learned, however, that regardless of the relationship or the acquaintance at the moment of the sexual assault, for the victim, the offender is a stranger regardless of the relationship or the acquaintance. We've also learned, thanks to the testing of untested rape kits around our country, that there is a significant incidence of serial or repeat offenders in both categories where the offender is known to the victim as well as when the offender is unknown to the victim. And we also have learned that there is crossover offending with an offender assaulting a victim who is known and also sexually assaulting a victim who is unknown. To be able to reach each level of this pyramid that we're looking at, beginning with the basis, experience, mentoring, and the support of others as well as training is vital. Looking at institutionalizing practices supporting prosecutors, we want to, as a community and as a SART, do our best to sustain the involvement of prosecutors who are champions and who can add immeasurably to the work of the SART. There are several institutional practices that we might want to give attention to. Caseloads for prosecutors with sex crimes are frequently very high, and we all know that these cases are very complex, and they're cases which require not only time, but considerable attention to the needs of the victim as we advance through prosecution. Most of these cases are major crimes, which also require a depth of experience, work with the victim, law enforcement, medical, and social services. When prosecutors are in trial, it may be wise to consider trial support for the prosecutors with other members of the prosecutor's unit assisting with other cases, or perhaps even case assignments could be somewhat modified during this period of time. To continue advancing prosecutors, whether in specialized units or in some offices that are not specialized units, they should be offered training opportunities and, again, support while they're engaged in training. Learning from other disciplines is also essential, as is cross-training in areas which also benefits law enforcement, medical professionals, as well as community-based and systems-based advocates. Earlier, we discussed collaboration and how collaboration enhances a victim-centered investigation and prosecution. If there is not a formal SART in a community, convening a sexual assault task force may be a good beginning for this work. We can identify key members, recognize current issues and needs, and then work collectively to develop sustainable goals which benefit victims and our community. Office support is critical and enables a prosecutor's desired level of participation on a SART. Transparency also and reaching out for evaluation and communicating with community agencies also can serve to enhance a SART's efforts. Victim-centered prosecution is a critical aspect of the work that we do. Having discussed the great value of a prosecutor champion on a team, it's time now to turn to the goals of the SART and how prosecutors can be of assistance. A victim-centered prosecution recognizes, respects, and highly values victim engagement and participation. Supporting a victim's participation also involves making sure that we're protecting a victim's privacy and safety throughout the process, from the time of investigation to the point of charging, through trial and or a plea and sentencing. It's important when we talk about a victim-centered prosecution that we make every effort to ensure that a victim has access to services that can be provided through the SART or from other community partners, as well as important information. We need to make sure that we are providing the fullest amount of information to victims while certainly protecting the integrity of the case. Offender focus is also critical to our work in the criminal justice system and the work that we do on a SART. It is the offender who caused victimization. Offenders intentionally and with some degree of premeditation target victims whom they believe they can successfully assault or assault and not face any retribution within the criminal justice system. We discussed a little bit earlier the formula of accessibility, vulnerability, and credibility. And I ask all of us this question: how many times have we been in trial as professionals who serve on a sexual assault response team and felt like the victim was on trial? All too often, this has been an experience when we know that it is the offender who's on trial. To accomplish this goal of offender focus, we begin with victim interview and we go throughout the entirety of the proceedings that we're involved in. The focus needs to be on the offender. With a victim interview as an example, we might ask a question such as this: when he took your keys from you, how did you feel? Who bought the drinks? Who decided where to go that evening? Who decided when to leave? We need to pay attention to the dimension of the offender's control and how the offender's control impacted the victim and essentially eliminated any vestige of a choice that the victim had during those events. Our analysis should be driven by an accurate and unbiased analysis of a case and a thorough understanding of the applicable law. Our goal is to ensure that criminal justice professionals protect victims' rights while focusing on the actions, behaviors, characteristics, and intent of the offenders. Offender focus then is a critical aspect of our work, and at all times we need to keep in mind that the offender caused the victimization. When we encounter, as an example I mentioned earlier, a delayed disclosure, we need to look to the offender as having employed the means to impair the victim's ability or choice to make that disclosure. Many victims of sexual assault have indicated that in their experience, the crime doesn't end. It goes on and on and on. And the offender's involvement and the force that was used against the victim to prevent or to limit a disclosure is very much operational, and it continues. A trauma-informed approach, as we've discussed, is critical to the work of a sexual assault response team, as well as to prosecutors and investigators. Recognizing that the offender inflicted trauma on the victim is the beginning of a dynamic approach to the following aspects of work. And we'll turn now to different stages that a SART will not only be made aware of, but will be discussed at the SART and informationally from the prosecutor as well. In an investigation, it's important to recognize the centrality of the victim's experience and indeed to focus on evidence and collect evidence that may be physical, psychological, and physiological. This evidence of the victim's experience at a later point may allow the jury to connect and come to understand insofar as possible the victim's experience of the crime. Again, the crime being caused by the offender. Interviewing the victim needs to be trauma-informed. Many times a victim will want to have an advocate present for that interview, and this is something that can also be discussed in the SART as well. Law enforcement has also gained immeasurably from the presence of an advocate who is there to support the victim during the time of the interview. And during that initial trauma-informed interview, investigators are going to be asking questions that allow a victim to recount their sensory experience of the crime, what the victim saw, heard, tasted, felt. All of this information will certainly provide detail that can be pursued in a follow-up investigation. It's important also to remember that a victim's sensory perceptions can also be impacted by trauma. For example, a victim presented information at trial how when the offender held his hand up to her throat, it was almost like she could feel it on the back of her neck. And there was not an actual physical penetration, but the impact of that touch, that harmful and offensive touch by the offender as he engaged in the commission of a sexual assault, was something that in the victim's memory was vastly augmented due to the trauma that she felt. And the victim was then asked if she was able to recount what she thought at that point. And in her mind, she felt that she was going to die. And many, if not most, victims of sexual assault, whether the offender is known or unknown, fear their death or serious bodily injury. And finally, the victim was asked how she felt during this period of time, and she was able to recount a kind of darkness, even though it was still light. The darkness that may come about due to an impairment of breathing, or again, the impact of shock during that crime of sexual assault. So this example that I'm offering for your consideration illustrates the importance of sensory details and how those details actually can be affected by trauma that the offender is inflicting. These details are also important because they allow us the opportunity to communicate and, in fact, to recreate, in a sense, the reality of that crime for our fellow citizens who are jurors. One of the questions that we asked in jury selection in an effort to allow jurors, members of our community, the understanding that their life experience is important. We may ask them, how many of us have been impacted by a traumatic event in our life? And many hands in the courtroom will be raised. We'll then go on to ask, we're not going to impose upon you to discuss what happened in your life that was very impactful, but we do want to ask, were you able to talk about this right away? And many members of our community will disclose that they were unable to discuss a traumatic event immediately, and for some, they never were. And what we're talking about in this particular scenario of the example I'm using is laying the foundation for presentation of evidence that involves the impact of trauma on the victim and the victim not being able to disclose this crime at an earlier time. Only one example, again, but stemming from a trauma-informed approach. In terms of charging, being able to understand the victim's trauma and the offender's responsibility underscores the goal of charging and advancing the case when legally and ethically possible. To be able to bring charges in a case, we need to be able to establish the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And understanding the trauma, the victim's responses to trauma, is of great assistance in doing that. Emphasis needs to be given to also the ultimate response of a jury if the jury follows the law when the evidence is presented. Advancing the tough but provable case is certainly the work of justice. Preparing for trial and consulting with other professionals is vital, and a sexual assault response team offers this resource for prosecutors as well as a potential for expert testimony if the experts have not worked with or for the victim. So turning now to trial. We're talking about the emphasis on recreating the reality of the crime for the jury, replete with evidence of the victim's experience. And going back to the example that I used earlier, the forensic interview that was done in an investigation, which produced evidence of the victim's sense of a traumatic touch committed by the offender during the sexual assault. What's also important about this is that the jury will try to place themselves in the position of the victim to try to come to understand her response to the crime. The jury will try to understand the level of fear that the victim had when she felt the offender's hand nearly penetrating to the back of her neck. When the jury uses their own experience to try to understand a victim's experience, they're actually engaged in the process of assessing the viability of the victim's testimony and certainly the credibility. We're also going to be presenting evidence how the offender knowingly and intentionally planned the sexual assault. And when we step back as prosecutors and think about this work in the courtroom that we're privileged to do, it truly is a work of passion for prosecutors who are champions. Representing the state and giving voice to a victim whose voice was silenced by the offender is the calling of prosecutors. During the trial, we will undertake our best efforts to try to bring this crime alive through the victim's experience for our fellow citizens who are jurors. And going back to our discussion of champions and becoming champions whose cause is the cause of justice, certainly helps to advance the work that is being done in the courtroom. Sentencing. Whether there is a guilty plea or whether there is a conviction in a case, sentencing is a time of formal accountability for the offender. And it's also a time for the victim to speak directly about the recommended consequences or the sentence and restitution if the victim chooses to do so. Many times when there is a trial, the victim has most of the time already testified, but may still wish to address the court about the sentencing recommendation. It's important to discuss the sentencing recommendation with other professionals as well as the victim in an effort to fashion the best recommendation for sentencing under the legal considerations, the statutes which are employed. Discussing this with the victim can also help inform the prosecutor about the restitution that may be involved, the necessity for certainly continuing a no-contact order. But it also is a time that the victim should have input into the recommendation. And a SART may also have ideas also to offer to the prosecution about the recommended sentences. If an offender has pled guilty, obviously a victim has not had the opportunity of testimony. Some victims may wish to speak directly to the court at the time of sentencing. Some victims may wish to have their statement read by the prosecutor or an advocate who's been working with them, or perhaps they want the court to quietly read that document. But the victim's choice for this important part of litigation, the outcome of litigation, truly needs to be observed. It also needs to be underscored that for a SART, This is a great moment when extensive work comes to fruition. As I mentioned earlier, I tried a large number of cases, a substantial number of cases, while I was privileged to serve as a deputy prosecutor. And I never waited for a verdict alone. Other professionals who had done the hard work that helped inform my work in the courtroom waited also. And I think it's important when the verdict comes in to make every effort to contact members of the SART who are waiting as anxiously as the prosecutor is for the outcome. We should have made plans earlier for the contact with the victim when the verdict comes in. Sometimes the victim wishes to be present for a verdict. Other times a victim may wish to be informed as soon as possible. But whatever the victim's decision is, we need to make sure that we're unified in supporting that decision. Even if it takes a little bit of time for a victim to be able to travel from her home to attend court, we should ask the court to make that adjustment in the schedule so that the victim can be present when our fellow citizens who are jurors render their verdict. When that verdict comes in and when we notify other members of the team, we're underscoring again the respect that we all have for each other and the reality that we do our work together and we do our work for the victim. The victim is at the center of every SART. It is the victim's rights and needs that all of us work together to try to satisfy. And in every particular case that we work together as a SART or as a multidisciplinary team, we are learning more and more about how we can even better serve victims in our community in the future. So making certain that the work of the SART is not only respected but honored for the point that we have been able to achieve in this particular case, I think it's very important for all of us. So when we talk about going forward, for SART and for those of us who have been and are privileged to work as members of a multidisciplinary team, we're talking about continually advancing our efforts. A SART is involves a dynamic process as well as multidisciplinary professionals who are in a constant state of learning from each other and from other members of our community. It's important to recognize the value of prosecuting attorneys on a sexual assault response team, and also for prosecutors to recognize the great value that there is in working with other professionals. Whenever I had the honor of going to trial in behalf of my jurisdiction and in behalf of a victim who had been well supported by multidisciplinary professionals throughout our process, it was with a sense that I was representing the work of so many other professionals when I was in the courtroom. Having a prosecutor who is a champion, who is passionate about the work and knows that it is a privilege to serve victims and the community is going to enrich a SART. All of the professionals coming to work on a SART represent individuals who are passionately committed to serving the victim and who come from professions that can only enrich all of us as we discuss these cases and as we move forward for victims. In the end, after collaborating and building consensus and overcoming perhaps issues in that process, when we are unified and committed to a trauma-informed approach to our work, we greatly enhance our service to victims. Prosecutors then, in this context, are a link to justice, and justice is the calling of the SART. Whether we have a sexual assault response team in our communities, whether we have a multidisciplinary team of professionals, maybe we have a sexual assault task force that is looking to either of these goals, we need to look carefully to the ultimate goal of serving victims and serving our communities. Whether these cases are current cases of sexual assault that victims have given to our care, knowing the courage that it takes for a victim to disclose, or whether they are cold cases of sexual assault that maybe have not received attention for many years. One of the best ways that we can meet the needs of the victims and meet the needs of our communities is to come together as a team. And that's why we say that justice is the calling of the SART, and there's truly no end to the work that we can do as a multidisciplinary team or a SART when we come together in the service of this great cause. So I would like to conclude our discussion today recalling the words of Martin Luther King Jr. Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Patti. That was really wonderful and really informative, and I am so glad that you were able to share that, and I hope that everyone listening gets as much out of it as I just did. I just really love how you constantly focus on victims, and you really keep that at the center of your work and this presentation, and it's really essential for SART teams to really follow that model. So thank you so much for sharing everything you did today. I'd like to just remind folks that a lot of the things Patti talked about today as far as the role of the prosecutor and a lot of different aspects about SART teamwork. You can find more information at the SART Toolkit. So you can Google SART Toolkit, or you can find it at www.nscrc.org/SART Toolkit. NSCRC is a National Technical Assistance Provider, and we really encourage you to reach out if you have questions about anything related to supporting sexual assault survivors or working in the field of sexual assault. If we don't have an answer, we are really happy to connect you with other folks in the field who do. And Aequitas and Patti are some of our partners in making sure that you have the best, most up-to-date work and information. And again, I'd just like to thank you, Patti, so much for being here today. And I would like to also thank OVC again for making this toolkit, this webinar, and all of the other supplemental materials, videos, and webinars that are part of the SART Toolkit project possible. And thank you to everyone listening for all the work that you do in the field all the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.